boarding school was far away in London. When the horse and cart arrived, I said a quick goodbye to my mother and got on with my suitcase. I started crying because I was leaving my home, my mother, and Peggotty. I felt very alone in this big world. Salem House was the name of the boarding school. It was a large old building surrounded by a high stone wall. It was a horrible school. As soon as I arrived, the headmaster, Mr. Creakle, put a sign around my neck that said, "Be careful, he bites." I had to wear it all day long, and I was terribly embarrassed. Luckily, I made friends with two boys, Tommy Traddles and James Steerforth. Traddles was about my age, but Steerforth was one of the oldest and most popular boys. He was good-looking and came from a rich family. He called me Daisy and protected me from the other boys and the teachers.
"Give me your pocket money, Daisy,"
said Steerforth one day,
"and I'll buy food and drink for everyone. The boys will like you then."
I agreed, and that evening we had a pleasant time sitting on our beds, eating, drinking, and whispering to each other. I soon discovered that all the boys hated Salem House, which was one of the worst schools in England. They especially hated Mr. Creakle, who carried a heavy stick and used it to hit the students. However, Mr. Creakle never hit Steerforth, and so I admired Steerforth. He became my best friend. I was glad to go home for the Christmas holidays, and was surprised to find that my mother had a new baby. However, she looked tired and worried, and she was also very thin. The Murdstones hated me even more than before, and I was happy to go back to Salem House, where I could see my friends Traddles and Steerforth again. 2 months later, in March, on the day of my birthday, Mr. Creakle called me to his office. As soon as I saw his wife waiting for me, I knew that something was wrong. Mrs. Creakle looked at me kindly and took my hand.
"My dear David, your mother has been ill, very ill. I'm so sorry to tell you. She's dead."
My legs felt weak, and tears ran down my face. I couldn't stop crying. I felt terrible. Now I was an orphan, and I was really alone in the world. I returned home for my mother's funeral, which was such a sad experience. The Murdstones were as cold and horrible as ever. Only Peggotty comforted me. She told me about my mother's death and how the baby died too. After the funeral, Miss Murdstone said,
"We don't need a servant anymore, Peggotty. You must leave."
Peggotty didn't have another job, so she decided to go and stay with her brother in Yarmouth. She invited me to go with her for a holiday, and the Murdstones, surprisingly, agreed. I was glad to see Daniel, Peggotty, Ham, and Emily again. They were wonderful people. Peggotty decided to marry Barkis, who had a nice little house in Yarmouth, and they were very happy together. Before going back to the Murdstones, Peggotty said,
"Remember, David, I'll always love you, and I'll always help you."
When I returned home, the Murdstones were not happy to see me. My stepfather said to me,
"Education is too expensive. You must go to London and get a job. You must work and be independent."
I was only 10 years old and quite small for my age, but I was sent to London to work in a warehouse. My job was to wash bottles and put labels on them. I earned very little, and I worked long hours in bad conditions. Several other boys worked with me, but I didn't make any friends because they treated me badly.
Is this going to be my life?
I often asked myself.
Am I going to wash bottles forever? I'll probably forget everything I learned from my mother and at school.
I was extremely unhappy and alone. In London, I needed an inexpensive place to stay, so I rented a room from the Micawber family, who always needed extra money. Mr. Micawber was a tall man with a bald head that looked like an egg. He always spent more money than he had, and always owed money to shopkeepers. The Micawbers were quite poor, but they tried not to show it. I often bought my own food, some bread and cheese, because the Micawbers hardly had enough for themselves. I liked them because they were always kind to me. Although the family had problems, Mrs. Micawber often said,
"Mr. Micawber will be a great man one day. He's my husband, the father of my children, and I'll never leave him."
One day, Mr. Micawber was taken to prison because he owed so much money. However, after several weeks, Mr. Micawber's debts were paid, and he left prison and was free. The Micawbers then left London and went to Plymouth, in the southwest of England. I didn't have any friends in London who could help me or give me a place to stay. I didn't know what to do, and I felt very lonely. My job at the warehouse was horrible, and I hated it. I couldn't continue to work. I really wanted a better life and a brighter future for myself, and I decided to run away.